Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show where we try to cut through all the noise. We take a pile of sources and we pull out the key bits of knowledge to help you feel genuinely informed.
Yeah, there's just so much out there.
Exactly. We're all constantly swamped with news, information about global economic systems, their problems, inequality, climate change. It's a lot. It can feel really overwhelming.
Totally. How do you even start to make sense of it without getting completely lost?
Well, that's what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into the, let's say, many criticisms of capitalism and also the huge range of solutions and alternative models people have come up with, throughout history right up to now.
And just to be clear, this isn't about picking sides. It's really about understanding all the different viewpoints, the specific arguments people make.
Precisely. Our mission here is to unpack these sometimes pretty complex ideas, get the core insights out, and connect the dots. So hopefully you walk away feeling well-informed, maybe with a couple of surprising things to think about later.
Okay, let's get into it.
All right, let's start by digging into the history, the philosophical roots of these critiques against capitalism. You go way back, and you've got Karl Marx. He believed the working class, well, because of their position, how they related to the means of production, and just their sheer numbers, they'd be the ones to drive a socialist revolution.
Right. He saw it almost as built into the system itself, an inevitable outcome.
Yeah.
And then Vladimir Lenin, he really developed that. In his work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that was 1916, Lenin argued that capitalism just had to lead to monopoly capitalism, to exporting capital. Imperialism, he called it.
Its last and highest stage, wasn't that the phrase?
That was the phrase. He saw this expansion as necessary for capitalism to survive, finding new markets, new resources, as the home ones got saturated. It's a really powerful argument.
It is.
And it's worth pointing out, too, some later Marxian economists, in the 20th century, they viewed capitalism more as like a social formation where capitalist processes dominate, sure, but they aren't necessarily the only thing happening. Other systems can coexist.
That's a key nuance. Now, this historical stuff, it brings up a really big question, one that scholars still wrestle with. How compatible is capitalism with what we call unfree labor?
Ooh, yeah.
Because on the surface, it feels like they shouldn't mix, right? Freedom, free markets.
It's a deeply challenging question, and the sources we looked at don't shy away from it. You have labor historians, scholars like Tom Brass, who've argued pretty directly that unfree labor, think slaves, indentured servants, even prisoners, is actually, well, perfectly acceptable to capital.
Wow, okay.
And Greg Grandin, he goes even further. He basically says capitalism originates in slavery. His quote is striking. When historians talk about the Atlantic market revolution, they are talking about capitalism. And when they were talking about capitalism, they are talking about slavery.
So not just compatible, but foundational in his view.
That's the argument. And it's not just Grandin. You've got Edward Baptist, Jen Beckert, Matthew Desmond. They've all written extensively, documenting how slavery wasn't just some side issue. It was integral, fundamental to the often violent development of American and global capitalism.
It really reframes that early history.
Absolutely. And it has echoes today. Look at a contemporary thinker like Slavoj Žižek. He argues global capitalism has created new forms of, quote, contemporary slavery.
What does he mean by that?
He points to examples like migrant workers in the Arabian Peninsula, often stripped of basic rights, or the kind of total control exerted over workers in Asian sweatshops, or even forced labor used to get natural resources in parts of Central Africa. It makes you think about coercion in maybe new ways.
It really does. One of the most fascinating parallels that comes up in these critiques is the historical comparison people made between wage labor and actual slavery.
Right, that wage slavery concept.
Exactly. It forces you to question what free labor really means. Thinkers like Proudhon and Marx, again, they really dug into this when the Industrial Revolution kicked off.
Even the Luddites, remember them? The English workers smashing machines back in the early 19th century?
Yeah.
Their big thing was the dehumanization they felt from the machines, from the whole industrial system.
And here's a really wild historical detail from the sources. Before the U.S. Civil War, defenders of slavery in the South actually used the term wage slavery.
Get out of here.
They used it to compare their slaves favorably to workers in the North, arguing basically that their slaves were better cared for than these supposedly free wage laborers in the factory.
That's an incredible rhetorical jujitsu move.
Isn't it? But it didn't stop there. After the war, in the Gilded Age, labor union activists picked up the same metaphor. They found it really useful.
Turning it back around.
Yeah, according to Lawrence Glickman, references to wage slavery were everywhere in the labor press back then. You couldn't find a speech by a labor leader without it. So it wasn't just some academic idea, it was a real rallying cry for workers who felt exploited.
That makes sense. Beyond these really deep social critiques, there's also the Marxian economic argument. The idea that constantly accumulating capital, which is like the engine of capitalism, leads to irrational results. A misallocation of resources.
Meaning?
Meaning, in this view, industries and jobs get created just for the sake of making money, not necessarily to satisfy actual human demands or needs. It suggests the system's own logic can kind of override what society genuinely requires.
That's a powerful critique, the system serving itself, maybe, before serving people. And that idea about the system's inherent priorities leads us right into looking at capitalism's global footprint economically and environmentally.
Yeah, this is where that drive for profit hits the real world, often with unsustainable results.
One of the big criticisms here is the growth imperative. Capitalism, just by its nature, seeking profits, it requires ongoing accumulation and economic growth or expansion. It has to keep growing.
And critics, like Derek Wall, as one mentioned, argue this built-in need for growth is just ecologically unsustainable, especially because it depends on constantly increasing consumption, on a planet with limited resources.
That seems like a fundamental conflict, doesn't it? Infinite growth on a finite planet.
It's at the heart of a lot of environmental critiques, yeah.
So what does this look like on the ground? Well, you see things like rising income inequality. It's happening within many countries and also between them. These wide disparities persist in both the global north and the global south.
Absolutely. The UN Development Program, they reported something like 1.57 billion people living in multidimensional poverty. That's not just about income. It's health, education, living standards.
1.57 billion.
And Branko Milanovic, his analysis showed global inequality is actually substantially higher than previously thought. He estimated it around 70 GD points, up from earlier estimates of maybe 65.
And remind us, the Gini coefficient, higher means more inequality, right?
0 is perfect equality, 100 is total inequality.
Exactly. So going from 65 to 70, that's a significant jump towards more uneven wealth distribution globally.
Wow. And the UNDP had that really striking phrase, didn't they? Something like, there is a south in the north and a north in the south.
Yeah, that really captures it. Poverty isn't just confined to one region, and wealth isn't just confined to another. You find pockets of deep poverty in rich countries and extreme wealth in poorer countries. It breaks down those old geographical stereotypes.
Okay, shifting to the environmental costs. The sources point out a pretty stark disparity. The affluent, well, they contribute much more overall to greenhouse gas emissions from flights than working class people, and particularly the poor.
It's a clear link. More wealth, bigger carbon footprint, at least in that specific area like air travel. And think about shipping, marine transport. It's like the circulatory system of the global economy, right? Carries maybe 90% of world trade products.
Huge. And containerization, bigger ships, they've made shipping costs plummet, like down by 80%.
But there's a hidden cost.
Always. In this case, considerably greater sulfur dioxide emissions and obviously the risk of oil spills. It's that classic trade-off. Global efficiency versus environmental health.
And then there's agriculture, the green revolution, industrial farming, massively dependent on fossil fuels.
Shockingly so. The sources highlight this estimate. It takes about 3 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie of food energy.
Wait, 3 in for 1 out. That seems incredibly inefficient.
It is from an energy perspective. And it's led to significant land degradation. We're talking nearly 2 billion hectares affected, impacting 2.6 billion people. It's a system that's both energy hungry and damaging to the land itself.
3 calories in, 1 out. That's sticking with me. Okay, let's talk about something else huge. The militarization of global capitalism. The spending figures here are just staggering.
They really are. Globally, back in 2008, military spending hit $1.47 trillion. And the U.S. alone accounted for almost half of that 48%, $771 billion.
Just incredible amounts of money.
And put it this way, in 2010, global military spending was over $1.4 trillion. That's more than the entire GDP of the world's 50 poorest countries combined.
Wow. What's the implication there, according to the sources?
The argument presented is that this massive military spending basically ensures corporate hegemony over the world system. It's the military power of the U.S. and its allies that underpins and protects the global capitalist order.
And it gets even more complex, right? There's the privatization of warfare.
Yeah, that's a major trend. In 2010 alone, the U.S. government subcontracted 202 billion with a B to private mercenary companies.
So it's not just state militaries anymore. Taxpayer money is going to private companies to conduct military operations.
Exactly. It shifts the dynamics quite a bit.
This ties into the role of the state itself. Some argue that pretty much all societies are state capitalist if they use the government to push economic development within this global system.
Right. It's not just one model. You see numerous national variants of state capitalism, American, Japanese, Australian, Chinese. They all use the state in different ways to support their economies within the larger capitalist framework.
And another big piece of the global picture now is NGOs, non-government organizations.
Huge growth there. They actually channel more development aid to the global south now than the World Bank and the IMF put together.
That's a massive shift in how aid flows and who holds influence, isn't it?
Definitely a critical feature of the modern global political economy.
Okay, let's pivot now and dive into the financial systems. They're always under the microscope, it seems. Economists talk about market failure, right? When the market doesn't allocate goods and services efficiently.
Precisely. And thinkers like John Maynard Keynes, he famously argued for government intervention because he didn't fully trust free markets to self-correct. Paul Krugman makes a similar point. Sometimes individuals acting in their own self-interest can lead to really bad outcomes for society as a whole.
What kind of bad outcomes are we talking about?
Well, the sources list things like monopolies, one company dominating, or monopsonies, that's the flip side, only one major buyer, insider trading, using secret info for profit, price gouging, all seen as potential failures of unregulated markets.
And there's a specific critique about deregulation, isn't there?
Yes, the argument is that the market deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s made the boom periods artificially high, which then meant the bust period will be deeper when the crash eventually comes, like stretching a rubber band too far.
And we saw that play out with the big banks, didn't we? The sources described them becoming like gambling dens.
That's the evocative phrase used,
Yeah.
Using complex financial products they didn't fully understand, lending recklessly.
Which led to lending freezing up entirely.
Right. And then massive public bailouts, because these institutions were considered too big to be allowed to fail. So the public ended up paying for the risks taken by private finance.
That's a recurring theme. Okay, what about the shadows? Tax havens, global tax evasion. This stuff is fascinating.
It really is. And it's not just straightforward fraud, though. That's part of it. It includes these legal gray zones, like multinationals shifting profits to shell companies that don't really do anything, just exist on paper in a low-tax place.
Or just moving yourself to a place with special tax deals.
Exactly. Perfectly legal sometimes. But the core insight from the sources is that all these methods, legal or illegal, reduce government revenue. And they massively increase inequality because it's primarily the wealthy and corporations who can take advantage of them.
The scale is just mind-blowing, isn't it? The number of tax havens has apparently more than trebled since the 80s deregulation.
It exploded.
Yeah.
And listen to this figure. Estimates suggest over $600 billion has leaked out of sub-Saharan Africa since 1975 into secret offshore accounts.
600 billion from just one region. Imagine the development loss.
It's staggering.
Oh.
And globally, the world's wealthiest individuals have parked $11.5 trillion offshore.
Trillion.
Dodging, it's estimated, over $250 billion each year in tax. And get this, that $250 billion annual figure. It far exceeds what the UN asked for in its Millennium Project to tackle global poverty.
So the money lost to tax dodging each year is more than what was needed for major global poverty initiatives.
That's what the comparison suggests. It really highlights the scale and the potential impact if that revenue were collected.
And there's research showing billionaires pay incredibly low effective tax rates, right?
Yeah, groundbreaking research shows their very low personal effective tax rates, often ranging between 0% and 0.5% of their wealth. Not income, wealth. And these rates are significantly lower than those of all other groups in society, even when you factor in all the different taxes people pay.
0 to 0.5%. That's just, wow, it reveals a huge disparity.
A profound one. Which brings us to attempts to fix this, like the Global Minimum Tax, the GMT. That was the big international agreement in 2021 for multinational corporations, often called Pillar 2.
How's that working out?
Well, the critique is that it's been dramatically weakened by a growing list of loopholes. So much so that it's expected to generate less than 5% of global corporate income tax revenue.
Less than 5%? Wasn't it supposed to be more?
The potential without the loopholes was estimated around 9%. So it's falling significantly short of what it could have been.
Why? What are these loopholes?
A big one is the carve-out for economic substance. Basically, companies can avoid the minimum tax if they show they have actual assets or employees in a low-tax country, even if the main reason they're there is tax avoidance.
So it actually encourages moving production, maybe just on paper, to low-tax places.
That's the concern. It could perpetuate the exact race to the bottom on corporate taxes it was meant to stop.
Okay, so the GMT is maybe not the silver bullet. Are there other forms of tax competition popping up?
Yes. The sources talk about new forms of aggressive tax competition, often targeting specific mobile groups, wealthy individuals, digital nomads, retirees with preferential tax regimes.
Good for the country offering the deal, maybe.
Perhaps locally, but globally, these are described as negative sum. They just shift tax bases around, cost billions overall, like $7.5 billion a year just in the EU, and they make tax systems less progressive, hitting lower earners harder, relatively.
A lose-lose globally.
Pretty much. And then there's the whole subsidies race for green energy producers, kicked off by the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act.
That sounds positive, right? More green energy.
It definitely has a positive side. Accelerating the shift to zero-carbon tech. That's good. But the risk, if it's not managed carefully, is that it mainly boosts shareholder profits and could actually increase inequality unless there are measures to make sure the benefits are shared more broadly.
A complex balance. So transparency helps, right? Sharing bank information internationally.
It does. The automatic exchange of bank info, the CRS system, in force since 2017, that was a landmark step. Huge progress.
Right.
But it has limits.
Like what?
Well, banks might not comply. We saw whistleblowers reveal, for example, that Credit Suisse was still helping clients hide money even after CRS started.
And it's harder for some countries to even join in.
Exactly. Developing countries often face big hurdles, legal frameworks, data protection, digital infrastructure, just to participate effectively in CRS. So they might miss out on tracking illicit money leaving their shores.
Okay, so given those limits, what are the proposed solutions? How do we get a better handle on this?
Some key ideas floating around. Move towards a global asset registry. Basically, track who owns what globally, and extend information exchange to cover things like real estate. Think Dubai properties as the new Swiss bank accounts. That's where wealth is hiding now, often.
Beyond just bank accounts.
Right. And then there's the idea of a minimum tax on global billionaires, maybe a 2% tax on their total wealth.
How much could that raise?
Estimates suggest around $220 billion a year, which is, interestingly, about as much revenue as the Pillar 2 global minimum tax on multinational profits is supposed to generate, even with its flaws.
So taxing billionaire wealth could bring in as much as the weakened corporate minimum tax.
Potentially, yes. It's a significant amount that could fund global priorities.
But wouldn't billionaires just move?
That's the risk, which is why there's also talk of an anti-exile tax. Basically, countries could still tax former residents for a period after they leave, discouraging moving just to avoid tax.
Interesting idea. Okay, one more tax concept, the financial transaction tax, or FTT, the Robin Hood tax.
Yeah, the idea is to tax financial trades, stocks, bonds, derivatives to deter excessive speculation.
Does it work?
Well, the research presented in our sources is pretty skeptical. One key finding is that an FTT has no impact on the kind of asset bubbles that caused the 2008 crisis, so it might not hit the root cause.
Okay. Are there downsides?
Significant ones, according to the research. Large leakage effects, meaning trading just moves elsewhere to places without the tax. This could slash potential revenue by maybe 55% just from people changing their behavior.
So you don't even collect the tax you expected.
Right. And counterintuitively, it might actually aggravate volatility instead of calming markets down.
Wow. Any impact on the real economy?
Yes, and this is crucial. It could increase funding costs for companies by 0.6%. That makes it harder for businesses to invest and grow, potentially leading to a decline in long-run GDP of 0.2 to 0.5%.
So the conclusion seems pretty negative on the FT2.
The assessment in the sources is basically the uncertain tax revenue likely doesn't justify the implementation headaches and the potential negative drag on the real economy. It looks like a policy with more costs than benefits based on this research.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Moving from critiques and financial fixes to broader visions for change, practical steps people are proposing. The Green New Deal, the GND, that's been huge in recent years.
Absolutely. It's a big, ambitious framework.
What are its main goals?
Broadly, it's about transforming the economy to be low carbon. So massive investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, protecting and restoring ecosystems like forests and wetlands, shifting to sustainable farming.
And creating jobs in those green sectors too, right?
Exactly. Expanding employment in green industries is a key part. It's often described as a green Keynesian approach.
Meaning?
It combines that Keynesian idea of government investment driving the economy, but with strong ecological priorities, like slashing carbon emissions. A core aim is to delink traditional economic growth from employment creation and extending well-being.
Trying to break that link between growth and environmental damage.
Precisely. Recognizing that the old model of growth often came at too high an ecological price.
It's interesting, the sources note the original New Deal under FDR actually had a significant green aspect.
Yeah, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. It put people to work during the Depression doing conservation projects, planting trees, building parks. So this idea of linking economic stimulus with environmental work, it has historical roots.
Fast forward to today. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, in the U.S. How does that fit in?
The IRA is seen as the most significant piece of climate legislation ever enacted by the U.S. government. Big deal. It's projected to cut greenhouse gases by about 37% compared to 2005 levels.
That sounds substantial.
It is progress, definitely.
Right.
But the assessment is also that it's not close to sufficient. Estimates suggest we need maybe up to 4 times as much funding to really meet climate goals. So it's a major step, but not the final destination.
And it has flaws, too.
Yeah, criticisms include things like it still allows for new oil and gas leasing, and it provides funding for controversial technologies like carbon capture and storage, CCS, and nuclear energy, which not everyone agrees are truly green solutions.
Okay, what about carbon pricing? Putting a price on pollution.
2 main ways to do that. Emissions trading schemes, often called cap and trade, like under the Kyoto Protocol, and straightforward carbon taxes.
How does cap and trade fare in the critiques?
Pretty poorly, in some sources. Criticisms include countries consistently missing their targets, a lack of real legal penalties, and the argument that it basically would enrich private traders at the expense of lives and livelihoods in the South, turning pollution rights into a commodity.
Some sources called it not a seaworthy lifeboat, right?
That's the phrase used, yeah.
Yeah.
Suggesting it's fundamentally flawed for tackling the scale of the climate crisis.
So what's the alternative? Carbon taxes.
The argument for carbon taxes is they're less complicated, more transparent, and less expensive to administer. Plus, crucially, they do not allow speculators to create financial instruments based on the right to pollute. It's more direct.
Have these been tried anywhere?
Oh, yeah. Sweden and Finland were pioneers back in the early 90s. Today, you see them in various forms. Norway's is around $50 per ton of CO2. Sweden's around $40. Denmark's maybe $14. Different levels, but the mechanism exists.
And James Hansen, the climate scientist, he had a specific proposal for the U.S.
Right, his fee and dividend idea. You put a fee on carbon at the source, the mine, the port. Then you distribute 100% of that revenue back to the population equally, maybe through monthly checks.
So you make pollution expensive, but you compensate citizens directly.
Exactly. The idea is to make it politically feasible and protect lower-income households from rising energy costs.
Okay, moving beyond these market-based ideas, there's a push for more fundamental changes like public ownership and economic democracy.
Yeah, challenging some core assumptions. Public ownership can be a bit of a taboo topic in some circles, often dismissed as inefficient.
But is that always true?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
The sources acknowledge that some state enterprises can be inefficient, sure, but they also point out there are numerous examples of publicly owned enterprises that operate relatively efficiently. It's not inherently one way or the other.
So what would this look like in practice?
Well, eco-socialism, for example, calls for things like expropriation of monopolies in the energy sectors, taking private monopolies in essential areas like energy and putting them under public control.
And expanding the public sector elsewhere, too.
Right, radical expansion in transport, housing, social services. Basically, prioritizing public good over private profit in these crucial areas.
There's also this idea of participatory economics, or PARICON. What's that about?
That's a really interesting model. It imagines an economy based on workers' councils and consumers' councils that are self-managing. The key principle is that individuals have a, say, proportionate to the degree they are affected by any given decision.
Direct democracy in the economy.
Pretty much, yeah. A very different way of organizing things.
And related to that is economic democracy, more broadly.
Right, where businesses themselves could be owned by the workers.
Mm-hmm.
The John Lewis Partnership in the UK is often mentioned as a real-world example. It's entirely owned by its employees.
Okay, finance again. What about radical banking reforms, beyond just taxes?
Big proposals there, too. Things like banning purely speculative activity by banks, making them transparent and publicly accountable, ending the whole too big to fail problem and the bailouts that go with it, maybe through nationalization if a bank fails, rather than just giving it public money.
And restricting bank size.
Exactly. Preventing them from getting so large that their failure threatens the whole system.
What about money itself? How it's created?
There's a really fundamental proposal here that money creation should return to central banks. Right now, private banks create most money when they make loans.
How would changing that help?
The argument is it would make the system less profitable for private banks because they lose that power to create money and potentially more stable overall.
And controlling speculation in currencies.
Yeah, the idea of taxing cross-border transactions comes up again here, specifically to put the brakes on currency speculation and reduce volatility in global financial markets.
Are there alternative models already working outside the mainstream banking system?
Definitely. Think about traditional building societies or mutual savings banks. Credit unions are huge, 170 million members across 96 countries. And microcredit institutions like the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh have shown success in lending to the poor.
So different ways of organizing finance exist.
Absolutely. And even different philosophical approaches like Islamic lending principles.
How do those work?
The core idea is that profits and losses are shared by lender and borrower. It ties their interests together, very different from charging interest or usury, which historically often led to cycles of debt. It's a fundamentally different ethical framework for finance.
Fascinating. Okay, another big vision. Expanding the commons. What does that mean?
It means taking essential services and resources out of the market, decommodifying them, making them public goods, accessible to all, not sold for profit.
Like what kind of things?
The list is long. Water, land, food, health, education, social security and pensions, public transport, housing, hospitals and schools, seeds, culture, knowledge, and even democracy itself. Basically, the fundamentals of a decent life.
How would you possibly fund all that?
Two main sources proposed: establishing a decent progressive tax base, making sure wealthier individuals and corporations pay their fair share, and secondly, demilitarization.
Redirecting military spending.
Exactly. Remember that figure? 2010 military spending exceeded the GDP of the 50 poorest countries. There's an immense amount of resources tied up in the military that could, theoretically, be used for social good.
And what about wages?
Raising workers' wages is highlighted as crucial, especially because, as the sources note, the current share of profits between labor and capital is the worst it has ever been. Wealth is increasingly flowing to capital owners, not the people doing the work.
So, redistribution through higher wages.
Yes. And finally, there's this concept of ecological debt.
What's that?
It reframes the relationship between the global North and South. It's seen as an ethical and moral debt owed by the North to the South, stemming from centuries of colonial extraction and the environmental damage caused by industrialization, which disproportionately benefited the North.
So transfers of resources wouldn't be aid, but...
Just compensation. Acknowledging historical injustices and their ongoing consequences, it's a powerful reframing.
Okay, let's wrap up by looking at some real-world attempts, experiments, and maybe some unfinished business here. Socialism in practice. It's had a complex history.
Very complex. The Soviet Union, for example, obviously huge historically. But the sources note its constrained political life, the purges, arguing that both external pressures and internal dynamics prevented anything like socialist democracy from developing.
What about more recently, Latin America?
Yeah, Bolivia under Evo Morales is an interesting case. They did reduce poverty significantly from over 60% down to about 43% between 2005 and 2012, made real improvements in health, education, land access.
But there were criticisms too.
Yes, some analyses suggest they also followed a kind of reconstituted neoliberalism in some economic policies and faced issues with patronage politics. It's never simple.
And Ecuador faced protests over mining.
Right. Another progressive government that faced criticism for suppressing indigenous and environmental protests against resource extraction. It highlights the difficult trade-offs these governments face, balancing development with other values.
What about Cuba?
Cuba's resilience is remarkable, really. Despite decades of the U.S. embargo and the shock of losing Soviet support, their GDP dropped 35% in the early 90s, the special period they've endured. It's a case study in survival under extreme pressure.
And in Europe? Social democracy.
The sources argue that traditional social democracy has declined in many European countries under the influence of neoliberalism. Often, these parties end up acting more like sterile administrators who serve capitalism rather than fundamentally challenging or changing it.
So mainstream paths face challenges. What about grassroots alternatives?
There are many. Eco-villages are mentioned as examples, seen as like seedlings or prefigurative communities, small-scale experiments pointing towards a different future. They often have much lower environmental footprints, 10–50% less than their national averages.
And the transition town movement.
Yeah, that's focused on building community resilience, trying to reduce energy dependence, relocalize food systems, prepare for challenges like peak oil and climate change at a local level. Lots of practical bottom-up action.
Finally, there's this really big idea. A post-work society.
A fascinating vision, built on 4 pillars, essentially.
Yeah.
Fully automating the economy, reducing the working week, implementing a universal basic income, and achieving a cultural shift in the understanding of work.
Moving beyond work as the center of life.
Exactly. Now, global capitalism is moving towards automation, that's clear. But the sources note that the other pieces, shorter work weeks for all, UBI, that cultural shift, they're not components of its modus operandi, not part of its usual way of doing things.
Which leads to this interesting idea of nested scenarios.
Right, Holmgren's concept. It suggests individuals might hold private beliefs about needing lifeboats or wanting an Earth-steward future, but their public behavior as workers and consumers mostly reinforces the current system, whether that's brown tech or maybe mainstream green tech.
A gap between private hopes and public actions.
Yeah, a kind of cognitive dissonance, perhaps, which connects to the final idea from Wilkinson and Pickett.
About changing public value.
Exactly. Shifting things so that conspicuous consumption, buying flashy stuff to show off, isn't seen as success, but as part of the problem, a sign of greed and unfairness, which damages society and the planet. A fundamental shift in what we value as a society.
Wow. Okay, what a journey we've taken today. We've really covered a huge amount of ground, from deep historical critiques to very contemporary ideas about climate justice, financial fixes, new economic models.
It's a vast landscape of thought.
It really is.
Mm.
But the common thread, it seems, running through all these different perspectives is this deep concern about inequality, about environmental sustainability, and maybe about the fundamental purpose of our economic systems.
Yeah.
What are they really for?
Absolutely. And it's clear that while the problems are huge, there's no shortage of ideas, potential solutions, different pathways being proposed and debated.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Consider this point from the sources. If the current economic crisis shows us how dangerous huge salaries and bonuses at the top can be, and if rising inequality maybe distracts us from tackling these pressing environmental and social problems because we're just focused on getting the economy moving again,
Yeah.
then what actions, maybe personal, maybe collective, could genuinely start moving us towards a different kind of society? One where maybe human well-being and the health of the planet are truly prioritized over just perpetual growth and private profit.
That's definitely something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.